Welcome back to Life's Cholent. My name is Avital, and today I'm very excited to be continuing in the series about the Jewish life cycle. Last week we had the pleasure of speaking with Chani Fingerer, who is a labor and delivery and obstetrics nurse, and she spoke wonderfully about the Jewish perspective on birth. And this week, in continuing with that series, we're moving on to the next life cycle event, which is the ritual circumcision called a Brit Milah that happens on the 8th day of a Jewish baby boy's life. And our special guest this week is Rabbi Eliezer Lawrence, who is a mohel, the person who performs this ritual circumcision. He is also a teacher and a linguist, and Rabbi Lawrence talks us through the different traditions surrounding a Brit Milah and gives us wonderful insights into their meaning and into how a Brit Milah fits into the larger Jewish life cycle. And so it's really interesting and something that I think everyone can learn from and will find fascinating as well. And so I'm very excited for you all to hear the interview. Welcome back to Life's Cholent. My name is Avital, and today we have a very special guest with us, Rabbi Eliezer Lawrence, who is a rabbi, a teacher, and a mohel. And today we are going to be talking about a Brit Milah and what it is, the traditions, and we're so excited to have you here.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So I felt like before we get into the main part of the interview, we should talk a little bit about sort of defining what a Brit Milah is and what your position is. I introduced you as a mohel, so if you could please explain what that is as well.
Well, a mohel is the person who does the bris. Actually, you mentioned the word Brit Milah, so that's like the Hebrew word for bris, and the word milah is related to the word mohel. So that's how the word mohel came into being. It's sort of, you think you would see, oh, that's the bris guy. But mohel, some people say moil, which is the more Yiddish pronunciation. People just say mohel, depends on where you're coming from. Okay, so a Brit Milah or a bris means circumcision, but the ceremony is much more than the circumcision. It's really like a welcoming, the first time a baby boy is welcomed into a community and sort of seen as a community member. And after that, he's actually named. So a lot of people for the first 8 days of a baby boy's life just call him baby boy. And because they don't want to name him until his actual naming ceremony, or they'll come up with a nickname. I had a bris recently where the child kept on being referred to as Jelly Bean before he was actually named by his Jewish name. And the naming ceremony is done over. First, there's a glass of wine, and then he's announced as this is the child, and he shall be known as this name for the rest of his life. And there's always these themes of thinking about not just this day, meaning the 8th day of his life, but also like what his life is going to be. So there's prayers that say, may his mother and father enjoy his growing up, and may they merit to see him. And we all pray that he should be able to have a life filled with Torah and good deeds and building Jewish families. So it's really like it's the send-off, the first celebration of hopefully a wonderful life filled with Jewish ritual.
If somebody's never been to a bris or Brit Milah before, so let's maybe go through the steps a little bit. So everybody sort of arrives, and what is the first thing that they can expect to have happen?
The first thing they could expect to have happen is it's so funny. I've done so many brises now in the pandemic that what I'm about to describe is like so atypical. What I would say the first thing that happens now is they turn on Zooms, everyone mutes, and then a bris. But I know that it's not God willing. We'll get back to the normal time soon.
Absolutely.
But generally, it starts off with the words Baruch haba. Now, Baruch haba means blessed is the one who comes. It's the way that in Hebrew that they say welcome. And this is, it's basically everyone's gathered around. The baby is sort of out of the room or off to the side, and someone is holding the baby. And the mohel, or the rabbi officiating, says Baruch haba, welcome. Blessed is the one who comes, and the baby is escorted in by someone called a kvater or a kvaterin. The kvater is masculine, kvaterin is feminine, and that's sort of like the escort, loved one of some sort, and they can pass the baby from kvater to kvater. And everyone's watching and enjoying, and the baby might be on a pillow, or he might be held without a pillow, and then the baby is brought to sit on a chair, and all by himself, or at least it looks like it's all by himself, because this chair is actually called the chair of Elijah the prophet, Kiseh Shel Eliyahu. And Elijah the prophet is known to be the actual angel of the Bris. He's been at every single Bris for all time. I guess not at Isaac's Bris, because that was before his time. But since his time, so the same way he comes to the Passover Seders, so too does he come to every Bris, and he's holds the baby for that period of time. A few prayers are said, and everyone might be taking pictures or singing. I sing Eliyahu Hanavi, like Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, right? And that's an opportunity to take stock in the moment. And then the baby is actually passed to the person called the sandik, which is the person that holds the baby during the bris itself.
That's great. That is exactly what I was looking for. And then the sandik holds the baby for the duration of the circumcision, correct?
That's correct. And that duration could be depending on what the mohel does in advance, because there's some prep that gets done. So all brises generally take the same amount of time, but some mohels do it in advance, and some people do the preparation like while on the sandik's lap. But the whole thing should take between 30 seconds to 2 minutes in terms of prep work and bandage, etc. And then he's taken from a bracha is made by the mohel, which is Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kishem mitzotav v'tzivanu al hamilah. Blessed are you, God, ruler of the universe, who had commanded us on the mitzvah of Brit Milah, of circumcision. And right after the actual circumcision, the father says a special bracha, because it was his mitzvah that he's sort of giving over to the mohel to do, and that bracha is Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kidshanu mitzotav v'tzivanu la'achniso b'brito shel Avraham Avinu. Blessed are you, God, ruler of the universe, who sanctified with us with his commandments and commanded us to place him, meaning the baby, into the covenant, into the agreement, into the contract between God and the Jewish people, into the covenant of Abraham, our patriarch. And then everyone responds in unison. That's the part where everyone gets involved. And they it's like this call and response. It's lahachniso bivrito shel Avraham Avinu is the end of that bracha. And then everyone responds. Kishem shenichnas labrit. Kain yikanes leTorah ulechupa ulemasim tovim. Just as he enters into the covenant of Abraham Avinu, Abraham our patriarch, so too should he enter into a life of Torah, of chuppah, which is like the wedding canopy, or thinking more broadly of Jewish family building, and ma'asim tovim, and good deeds. So this is that as I mentioned earlier, sort of that like getting him ready for this is the first mitzvah of a life of many mitzvot.
That's lovely. Thank you so much for that explanation. It's always a really nice moment. And actually, I believe at a Jewish wedding also, when he gets to that life milestone, if that's someplace he wants to go, that they say Baruch haba, which was that first sort of welcome, the Hebrew welcome into the ceremony. I think that they say that at a Jewish wedding once the bride and the groom have entered, or maybe that once they're under the chuppah, something along those lines.
That is 100% true. It's actually part of my spiel and shtick when I do brises. So perfect. The truth is that's absolutely true, and that's not the only echo of the wedding that's at the bris. Besides the mention of chuppah, besides Baruch haba, which is the same thing that's said to the groom, or Brucha haba, the feminine version, said to the bride when she comes under the wedding canopy, but also the same melodies are used. So the melodies of that are used at a Jewish wedding are meaning the nusach, uh, the chanting melody of the brachot are exactly the same. So it's like so there's these echoes throughout different life cycle events from the first 8 days, and even if you have a baby naming a zevet habat for a girl, use the same nusach, and going all the way to the wedding. So that it's like an amazing either call forward or call back when you have these like life cycle moments to sort of just pause, and there's so much of an association with the different senses, right? Reading is one thing, but hearing and experiencing in that way, you're like, I'm brought back, or I'm brought forward, or thinking about, or maybe the parents are thinking about their own wedding and thinking about that their wedding and union brought about this miracle.
That's beautiful. I love that answer, and that is really cool. I hadn't really thought about all those different parts that echo at different Jewish life cycle events. That's very, very cool. Very cool to see. I also wanted to ask you why you decided to become a mohel, and how you became interested in it, and how you actually go about becoming a mohel.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. So I wanted to become a mohel in a pretty interesting way, which is, my primary orientation was to be a rabbi, because I wanted to serve the Jewish community in a way that's both reflects a sensitivity to the diversity of Jewish life, but also that's coming from a traditional standpoint that's rooted in traditional Judaism and Jewish law. So that was sort of the type of rabbinate that I wanted to bring, and I heard a few stories about mohalim or mohels that I didn't love in terms of their public relations with certain families, and I'm sure there are great mohels out there doing wonderful things. I know some of them as well, but there was one particular story which was at a shul that's very close to my heart. There was a same-sex family that was looking to do a bris. They weren't really affiliated, but the grandfather, father of one of the women, really wanted his grandson to have a bris, and they were willing. And so they called up the shul that I'm affiliated with. They asked, can we do a bris there? They found a random mohel. The father found a mohel, the grandfather of the child. And the story goes that the mohel was like making weird jokes, not knowing how to navigate the situation in a way, because he was presumably coming from probably an ultra-Orthodox background, maybe not interacting with different types of people so often outside of communal norms. And it made people there feel uncomfortable. And it really took what could have been a wonderful opportunity to bring these two women in and make them feel welcome, to feel a little bit like, oh, maybe I don't have a place in Jewish life. So that was sort of like the trigger point for me to say, you know what, maybe I should bring the values of my rabbinate into a field that might be a little bit lacking.
I'm so glad that you did it, and that you've sort of begun to fill a void that maybe was in your community. And I forgot to mention when I introduced you, but you're based in the New York City area. And for those who want to learn more about you, your URL is familymohel.com, and I will leave that in the description below as well.
Fantastic.
At the beginning, I meant to ask you about your training and what it took to become a mohel, and I realized that we didn't circle back to it.
Okay, yes. So it's a very interesting process. It started off with me shadowing different mohalim to really get. At first, I couldn't even look at a bris. It was so scary for me. I had like a queasy stomach. So I went to a lot of I developed relations with different mohalim just to start to get what we call in Hebrew shimush, like experience. And there are generous mohalim who brought me along. And then I went and did my first certification through the Moreshet Avot Institute, which is in Israel, in Beit Shemesh. It's related to the chief rabbin in Beit Shemesh, so that they have training programs where you learn infant anatomy and just the way blood clotting works. In general, things that are all related to all medically related things that involve both the procedure and the way the body heals. On the one hand, you learn the procedure, and then you also learn all the related Jewish laws. So my certification from that institution was both in the procedure itself and in making sure that I know all of the proper Jewish laws to make sure that it's kosher. So that's through the local rabbinate there as well. And then I did a second certification, which is that's like a newer thing, which is to have like the school that you go to do this. The second thing, which is more traditional, but in many ways, untradeable, is really in medical terms, the clinical rounds, or the clinical rotations, but in traditional terms, the apprenticeship, which is that I studied at the London School of Circumcision. I went to London and I just did brisses, under the auspices of a very well-known mohel every single day. It was like from day to night, and it was both. And in England, interestingly enough, a lot of the non-Jewish people who seek circumcisions, like Muslims and African immigrants, use mohels to do their brisses, to do their circumcisions. So that was a part of the training, and I just did that, and I spent time in England. I felt like I became English in a capacity, and then you essentially, when I got my second certification, I opened up my own practice.
That's amazing. Going back to the Bris Milah for a moment, why the eighth day is a question that I couldn't quite find an answer to, about why is it that we are bringing the baby boy into the Jewish community on the eighth day of life? Why not, the first day? As an example, in Judaism, we bury people as soon as we can, same day, next day, whatever happens to be. So why the delay?
It's a good question. I don't know if there's an actual reason. This is one of those things where it's like, because the Torah says so. That's just sort of what it is, which is that Abraham, our patriarch, was commanded to do a Brit Milah on his son Yitzchak, on Isaac, on the eighth day, and that just sort of became the Torah's commandment for that all people born specifically of that line of the Isaac line of Abraham should be have their bris at 8 days old. It's interesting to say that Ishmael, who was Abraham's other son, had his bris at 13 years old, which I think is maybe a little bit harder, especially in a time when maybe they didn't have the medical standards that we have today. But there are people that were doing circumcisions at all ages, even till this day. I think in some Muslim countries, circumcisions are things that are coming of age ceremonies. I don't think there's a specific reason, but I think that it's a perfect time, because you're able to see that the baby is vibrant and safe, and living in thriving, but it's also not too late, which is when you do a bris too late, then you start to need stitches, which you do not need in an infantile context.
Well, that's very interesting. I didn't know that, but you do bring up a good point. It's kind of interesting because Abraham, if I'm remembering correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, but he was the first person to be circumcised sort of for a Jewish purpose. But I guess the first baby on the eighth day to be circumcised would be his son, would be Isaac. That's quite an interesting biblical origin. So this tradition is one that is so long standing.
Oh yeah, over 3,500 years.
It's amazing. And another question that I couldn't really see much of an answer to is, and there may not be an answer to this question, but it's interesting.
There could be. I may not know the answer.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. It seems like, so Judaism, generally speaking, we sort of believe that our lineage of, if you're Jewish, it's because your mother is Jewish. So it's interesting to me that something that is sort of sealing a covenant that you are part of the Jewish people is something that happens around boys, around men. Do you know anything as to why that is?
Well, I do. I do think that, it comes from the Torah context. So I would say the Torah is a little bit more patriarchal oriented than the way it's played out rabbinically speaking. And there's, I mean, in terms of like tribal lines, if of the 12 tribes of Israel, that was generally through the father. So while Judaism passes through the mother, there's a lot of things that pass through the father as well, like if you're a Levi or a Kohen priest or a Levite. So those are things that go through the patrilineal line. What's important to think about is that it's really something that's sort of like it's dependent on anatomy, but it's really a mitzvah that's on all of the Jewish people. So if you happen to have that anatomy, then that's mitzvah fault, like you have to fulfill that mitzvah. But think about it, there are people, that are giving over their baby boys to do that, and that's a part of it. It's sort of, the commandment is to all of the Jewish people. And so in the same way that we have divided responsibilities more broadly in Jewish life, this might be one of those as well.
Absolutely. I think that's a good answer. And it is something that, in the past, in different anti-Semitic circumstances, circumcision was banned. And so it's something that I think people take a lot of pride in, both from a religious standpoint, but also from like sort of the freedom to express their religion and to practice. So I think it is a very cool and important tradition.
One of my teachers was involved and told me stories about this amazing people coming out of the Soviet Union, people who were 60, 70, 80, running to get a bris, right? Imagine the devotion and the feeling that this is such like a essential part of at least male or having that anatomy, Jewish identity, that people are willing and saying, this is the first thing I want to do when I experience freedom, freedom of religion. And I've had, teenagers call me up and say that my parents didn't give me a bris, didn't circumcise me, and I know that I'm Jewish. I know that my mother was Jewish, and I feel like I'm not like a part of it. And they're asking, can I help them? And I say, well, we have to obviously wait until I don't know if you would want to do anything against your parents' will at this context, but it being the American context, and we didn't parental consent. It actually is something that once someone is 13, it actually becomes their responsibility to fulfill. So up until 13, the mitzvah is on the father to do the bris for the child, but once the child becomes of the age of majority commandments, then it's his responsibility to actually find his own bris. So these teenagers that have called me and said, Rabbi, can I get a bris? We're on the right track, only that I don't want to. I say that there's also a mitzvah of honoring one's father and mother, and I think that you can probably wait until either you discuss it with them or it's something that you can come to when you're an adult.
That's so interesting. What a beautiful thing that people really want to rush to partake in this spiritual covenant. It's really beautiful, and I'm so really glad you shared those stories. So on your website, you mentioned something that mohel has to be someone who is an upstanding citizen. So, and you sort of define that as somebody who is shomer Shabbat, so they keep Shabbos, and somebody who keeps kosher. So it's interesting because several weeks ago I interviewed a chazan, and there was also something quite similar there, where if he's going to be somebody who leads in the community, you have to be somebody who is regarded as an upstanding citizen. So is there a sort of a source for that? Why do you feel like that's the case? How has it impacted your life, if it has?
Has it impacted my life? So, I mean, there are many mohels out there that don't necessarily fit that criteria. Mm-hmm. I don't want to say they're not upstanding. I think that it's important to make a distinction, and maybe I use that wording to be a little bit more approachable in terms of, Jewish ritual status of being upstanding. There's wonderful people that are not ritually observant. But I think, when you're fulfilling a mitzvah for someone else and you're doing it under, taking on the responsibility to provide something kosher, then there has to be an assumption that you care about kosherness, kashrut. So that's in general, someone who has to make sure that the restaurant is kosher, generally has to keep kosher themselves, and people who are preparing things in advance of Shabbat, we should assume that they are Sabbath observant as well, because we have to assume that if something is, we have to at least agree basically of a similar amount of importance, and if we don't, then it can get complicated about maybe people might skip over something if it's too easy. For example, in the kosher thing, right? If they bought like $100,000 worth of meat and it turns out it was all not kosher, it might be interested because they don't personally keep kosher to pass it off as kosher. And the same thing is by a mohel, which is to say that mohel is a bris is an extremely important mitzvah, and there are various halachot, Jewish laws that are involved in preparation for it, in the actual procedure itself, and afterwards that make that the person that does it ideally is someone who is at least well-versed in Jewish law and these particular Jewish laws, and someone who is part of the community, which traditionally has been defined as someone who takes a basic orientation towards observance. And there are some sources, which is the Shulchan Aruch, which is one of the primary foundational documents of Jewish law, of Jewish codes, says on the surface level, everyone is kosher to do a bris, but then it says, but someone who's considered to be mumar, which means an apostate, someone who might have converted out, or who breaks Shabbat in a public way to say, like, I'm different from that community. They may not. They're said not to be fit for a bris, and the commentator on the Shulchan Aruch, his name is the Ramah, Moshe Isserles, says that such a person who got a bris by someone who doesn't keep Shabbat and who sort of sees themselves outside of the community in that way might need a hatafat dam brit, which is to take like a little bit of blood from the site of the circumcision as like a ceremonial bris to sort of make whatever it was kosher, sort of like boiling water on dishes to make that kosher if something non-kosher occurred.
Maybe this is a bit of a tangent, but that's also what happens for people who convert to Judaism who had already had a circumcision, correct?
That's correct. So there's a few contexts in which that would happen. And is if someone's converting, then they do this hatafat dam brit, which means taking a small little bit of blood, using the same thing that one would use, like someone a diabetic, to take their blood insulin levels, sugar levels. It's called a blood lancet. So it's very, very small, barely hurts. So that's to convert. If someone had a bris by someone who was not upstanding in this particular way, again, not that someone's not a good person, but not ritually observant, one might say that you need to do a. Some would say maybe not. So I try to be as if someone doesn't want to do that, and there was a Jew, that did the bris, even if they weren't the most kosher keeping, one might be able to find a way of not having to do a hatafat dam brit. And the last context is if someone had a circumcision that was not done by a Jew at all or done earlier. So even if a Jew did a bris on the 7th day, it wouldn't count as an actual mitzvah. So since the mitzvah doesn't start until the 8th day, then essentially the kid is circumcised, but he hasn't fulfilled the mitzvah. So the way to fulfill that mitzvah theoretically would be to do the hatafat dam brit later on.
Oh, that's really interesting. I also did not know that. So thank you for sharing that. So maybe a tough question, but for someone who is teetering, whether they should have their son get a Brit Milah or not, why might you argue that somebody should do it?
Well, first of all, I try not to argue. that's I guess part of.
Not argue. Would you encourage someone to do it?
I would encourage people to, first of all, to feel their feelings, because that's something that's really important to me, which is to really just be honest and to hold anyone's feelings as they're entering into the room or as we're in pre-discussions. I've had parents call me up and say, Rabbi, can you please convince me that I should give my son a bris? And which is an interesting thing to do. And it means that there's a part of them that wants to hear and wants to be assured that everything's going to be safe and done properly and sterilely. And I think that that's part of the concern. And I really try to be there for that. But also to hold that it's something that's a little bit out there. It's probably the most tribal thing that the Jewish people does. We're very, very clean now. We're the people of the book. But this is something that really connects us to something spiritual and primordial, connected us to our ancestors in a way that is either experienced on the individual's body or on the bodies of our loved ones. So I think that it's sort of a leap of faith, and you can feel assured that it's obviously medically safe, and there's a lot of, the American Association of Pediatrics doesn't make recommendations either way in that it has to be done, but they certainly have documented benefits. But I try to stay away from thinking about that because I think that this is much more than potential medical benefits. It's about living with a mark on one's body, if so appropriate, of Jewishness. So, and also it's much easier for people if it happens when you're a baby than if it's later, like these, in the story that I mentioned of these people that are running to do brises, or these teenagers, as after the Soviet Union, or teenagers that are calling me up and trying to navigate, they said, I don't feel Jewish. They're like, meaning like I'm and I said, you are Jewish. I said, it's a mitzvah that you're not doing. But I think that you got to think about it. There's a communal affiliation that transcends not just the individual, but with it's trans-temporal. It spans the generations from time back to Abraham all the way, God willing, for many, many thousands of years to come of Jewish history. And I think that given the established safety of such a procedure, I would feel pretty sad for someone who had the opportunity to be a part of that, not be a part of that.
I think that's a great answer. And I like how you started that with realizing that people are coming from different places when they approach it. And, it's a decision that everybody has to take on their own level and as they can. So I'm glad that you mentioned that as well. Absolutely. In your own life, you've been to many, and maybe you can talk about the plural again of what a Brit Milah is in plural, but you've been to many. And so I'll let you say what that is, but also how has it maybe influenced the way you view life or religion by taking part of so many of these ceremonies?
So I'll start off with the plural question, which is there's different, it depends on your communal affiliation. If the official Hebrew word for plural of Brit Milah is britot, as we might hear in Israel, like we did a lot of britot, or in more Israel-aligned communities. In Yiddish, it's brissen, with an N sound at the end, brissen, like bris and brit are the same word with a different accent. And in Judeo-English, the English used among primarily ultra-Orthodox Jews, it's brissim with an M at the end. So, and I say brisses sometimes. I think that any brisses, brissim, brissin, britot. I think it's all fine. I'm a linguist as well, so I'm a descriptionist. I describe the way people speak and live out their Jewishness, as opposed to saying this is the way that it is. They're all fine. So what is it like to have been in these life cycle events of so many different Jews?
Yes.
Is that what the question was?
And how maybe if it's impacted you at all or changed your perspective on anything?
Well, I thank God I have the opportunity to serve such a variety and diversity within the Jewish community, and I've done a bris where everyone at the bris was completely covered in tattoos and really excited that their son is having a bris, and their Jewishness is maybe less less bodily, uh, made up. I mean, obviously, a tattoo is not as against Jewish love, but but to see someone being excited about this basic and essential marker of Jewishness, and see that that it's as important to them as it is important to people that instead of being covered in tattoos are covered in black hats and black shirts, black suits and white shirts, is quite remarkable. On the one hand, it shows me how these essential mitzvot, commandments that have marked Jewish identity, whether in times of freedom and of oppression, connect us all as Jews. And it also has given me the opportunity to also see like how different everyone is, which is I've done, I try to be as much of a chameleon as possible, to be not the center of attention, but really to bring the attention towards the family and to be the proper MC for that. So I try to adjust what I'm doing if it's a family that may know less Hebrew or be a little bit less Jewishly literate. I really try to be as explanatory as possible. And if there are people who are very, very observant, but might go through things more route, I also try to be explanatory, but maybe through a different lens, to have people sort of just check in and not say this is just something that we do. This is something that's very special. And I think that just knowing that this is something that's going on and that it's something that's shared by so many people, for me is an ounce of hope for such a divided Jewish life and such a divided Jewish community, that we're still doing this ancient thing. It's very rewarding.
That's wonderful. I really enjoy that answer. I think I've had the privilege to work in many sectors of the Jewish community, more religiously observant, less religiously observant, and there are a lot of things we have in common, but sometimes it's hard to see that on the surface, because you'll say, oh, well, they practice in this way and this group practices in this way, or they have these beliefs and we have these beliefs. But when you come down to something basic that's practiced throughout most Jewish communities, it's really, really beautiful to find those commonalities and say, oh yeah, we are all Jews and we all, have some of the same fundamental beliefs, and it's really something rewarding and moving to see. So I like that answer.
Absolutely.
What am I missing? Is there anything regarding a Brit Milah that we haven't covered that you think is really essential to share?
I mean, I think that you just got to be able to find a mohel that you trust, and one that is really listens and can be accessible to you. Like a big part of the Bris is beyond the Bris. I'm taking calls at all hours of the night, FaceTiming with families to, is my baby okay? Does he look okay? I'm like, he's fine. He's fine. But but it's important to take that seriously, and that's a big part of my practice, which is for people to know that I'm accessible, and also I make people sign a contract that says they will follow my aftercare instructions, because it's so important. I think some of the aftercare protocols, because it is a procedure, and it requires, it's a ritual procedure, but it's still a procedure and requires the attention. I think that sometimes people it's a 2-week process of healing mostly, and sometimes people get a little lackadaisical maybe at the end, and it's just really important to listen to what the mohel says in terms of and also always bring always get a second pair of eyes, if you have a family that's in the medical profession, or if you have a pediatrician appointment coming up. It's always good to keep your eyes out on how it's healing, because every person's anatomy is different and everyone's healing process is different. I think that everyone just goes to a bris and they think it's just that time, but it's a process of making sure that he gets better quickly, and it really is miraculous what the body is able to heal so wonderfully. And it's also connected to at the bris, after the baby naming part of the ceremony. We say Misha Berach, which is the prayer for the healing, and a baby gets their own Misha Berach, its own version, which is that he should have a speedy recovery because he entered into the covenant, sort of like a quid pro quo. That if the baby's doing this for God or the family's doing it for God, so God should help the baby get better very, very quickly. Which thank God in my experience has always happened.
Well, that's great. I'm glad that you added that too about the aftercare. I guess you kind of brought up one more question for me, which is, how do people find a mohel? Is it they have to ask people in their community? Is there a website? What do you usually suggest for people?
Word of mouth, reviews. I try to take pride in I've been collecting Google reviews for families. I mean, so, my website is family mohel, and because I really try to really connect with the families, and I try to. I don't do it as a shtick. I literally say we when I'm talking about because I really feel like I'm here. I feel like a lot of families call up in advance, and we sort of start the conversation in advance. They know how to think. I help them pick out a name sometimes. I help them think out this. I've become a Zoom advisor as well in terms of how a bris should be done via Zoom. So yeah, I think there's an element of word of mouth, asking people, looking up on the internet, seeing what other people are saying about them, is important as well. I think it's also important that there's a degree of sterility, especially in the context of the coronavirus. I had a lot of, funnily enough, I had a lot of people asking, back in the height of the pandemic, will you come and do it in the hospital? And I said, I will not, because hospitals are very dangerous. So I think it's some people think that, for the right answer is to do it in a hospital, do it in a medical setting. It's actually not necessarily the case at all. And some doctors, it may not be kosher for obvious reasons we discussed before. There's some people who are practicing as mohels who are doctors but don't sort of fit that criteria that we discussed about being Shomer Sabbath observant, or even they're not necessarily trained in the correct laws of because there's Brit Milah and there's circumcision, and circumcision have a wide variety of definitions in terms of also the methodology. So there's things you have to figure out, that it's someone that's coming from a source that is kosher, and also a source that really respects. I wear an N95 mask everywhere I go, in the context of the pandemic, because not only am I protecting myself, I'm protecting my families. I use dry heat sterilization on my instruments. I use everyone's wearing gloves. I provide PPE to the sandik who's holding the baby, in a face shield and a KN95 mask. So I think that that's actually something that I'm sure I don't have to tell people about, that's resonant with. That's another niche I think I try to fill in terms of traditional mohel, but really adjacent to standards that I think we'd all feel comfortable with, and not having to compromise in either direction. So I would check around in terms of asking people's procedures, like how they do it. Do they use what's the type of instruments do they use? What degree of are they wearing a mask while they're doing it? How do they sterilize? Those are things that I think are generally important.
I definitely agree. It's great that you've been able to find ways to adapt to that in these constantly changing times that we've been having recently.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much again for joining. It's been such a pleasure. If anybody out there is looking for a wonderful mohel in the New York City area, please do reach out to Rabbi Eliezer Lawrence. And the website is familymohel.com. And you can also find him on Instagram or Facebook at Family Mohel. I will leave all those links in the description below. But thank you so much again for taking the time, for teaching us. I've learned a lot. It's been very interesting. So I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, and you'll know that you might not recognize me on my pictures because I used to have a beard, but because of the efficacy of the N95 mask, you can't have a beard. So I've had to go clean shaven now. So I'm looking forward to growing that back when the pandemic, God willing, is over. And
Good. People will recognize you, I hope, now
I
that
hope
they've
so.
seen
You
you.
can tell by the glasses. That's me.
Exactly. Well,
Okay.
thank you so much.
All right, my pleasure. Thanks for doing this amazing work,
Thank you.
explaining Judaism to people. Wonderful work.
Thank you.